Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23rd, 2022. Several members, as you can see, are present in the room, and others are joining us remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of all members. Please wait until I do recognize you by name before you speak. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom is at the bottom of your screen, and you have a choice of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use their earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. As you will all recall, the committee suspended its meeting on Wednesday, December 7th, 2022, while debate on a motion was ongoing. Therefore, we are resuming this meeting, and the following motion is still on the floor. The motion read that the committee report to the House that because Nord Stream 1 is no longer supplying gas to Europe due to a blast that created a 50-meter hole in the pipeline, because the granting of a waiver for the export of Gazprom turbines sends the wrong message to Russia about Western support for sanctions, and because the government of Ukraine and Canadians have requested the waiver be revoked, the committee calls on the government of Canada to revoke the waiver to Russia sanctions granted for the export of Gazprom turbines by January 5th, 2023. Moreover, as you are all aware, I reconvened the meeting today because 6 members of our committee put forth a request to discuss the committee undertaking a study of the current situation in the Lachin corridor of Nagorno-Karabakh. While the committee has a few options on how to proceed, please note that a committee may only consider one motion at a time, and as I just mentioned, the committee is currently seized with the motion I just read, and therefore we need to make a decision on the motion before moving on to other business. Therefore, I'd like to hear briefly, if possible, the members on these points I just raised. Please note that if no consent is reached, I will let the members resume debate on the motion that I just mentioned earlier. As the chair, cannot bring a debate to an end while there are members present who still wish to participate. Now, Mr. Genis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As members are aware, we did significant work on the Gazprom issue through the fall, and I'm very pleased to see that following that work and what was, I think, an important contribution by this committee, as well as the expressed view of a majority of it over time, that the government made a decision to revoke the sanctions waiver. I had the floor speaking at that time, and if I still have the floor, I would propose the following dilatory motion: that the committee proceed to discussion of the matter raised by the letter sent last week pursuant to Standing Order 1064.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garnett. So we will now proceed to discussion of Order 1064 that was submitted by the 6 members.
Mr. Chair, just
Mr. Chair, that's a dilatory motion.
Yeah, so we'd have to vote. Or we could just agree to it unanimously, but yeah.
Is there unanimous consent? Okay, hearing no opposition to that, that is unanimous. So we will now, thanks to Mr. Genis, move to discussion on Order 1064 that was submitted by 6 members.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Bergeron has his hand up.
Okay, Mr. Bergeron, please.
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais...
Mr. Speaker, I have the following motion for members of this committee. I think that we could discuss this and could be amended if members of the committee would like it to be so. That pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertakes to hold a maximum of 3 meetings to study the present situation of the blockade of the Lachin region, de facto isolating the Nagorno-Karabakh region, that the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada, the Ambassador of Armenia, the Chargé d'Affaires of Azerbaijan, representatives of 2 communities in Canada, the permanent representative of the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic to the United States and Canada, and Graham Stefanian, the Nagorno-Karabakh human rights defender, be invited to testify by Friday, February 3rd, 2023, that the testimony and materials gathered by the committee at these meetings be taken into consideration in the study of the security of the Azerbaijan-Armenia borders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. We now go to Mr. Oliphant.
So I'm generally supportive of this, but my concern is that members called for a special meeting today when we had already agreed to have 2 meetings on the subject of the Nagorno-Karabakh situation. So today we are spending some time doing that. It would seem to me that that is an unusual request that came in from 6 members, and I'm always happy to have them explain that we had agreed that we would have a meeting on our first meeting back after January 31st would be on this issue. We had agreed to do 2 meetings on the general situation. I think I would like to move an amendment because we have a lot of pressing work on our agenda, which we've already agreed to undertake as a committee, that we add 1 extra meeting to the original 2 meetings. So we would do a total of 3 meetings, recognizing that we've already done 1 meeting. So I think, and I will prefer to use the word the Lachin Road because the word corridor does not have any legal standing. And I would call it, I find that the motion is already laden with ideas that we know what is happening there, but I'll let that go and simply move an amendment that instead of a total of 3 meetings, that we add 1 meeting to our existing study of the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh with a focus on the Lachin Road.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. Is there anyone else who would like to speak to this amendment?
Just on a point of order, could that be distributed? Because I don't know if I understood it, but if others did, that's great.
Yes, if I could just explain to Mr. Jennis. So we heard from Mr. Bergeron. Mr. Oliphant simply reminded all the members that we had previously agreed that our first session upon our return would be devoted to Armenia, Azerbaijan. We will be hearing from the Armenian ambassador and the Azerbaijani Chargé d'Affaires. So Mr. Oliphant's amendment is that we do proceed with what we had previously agreed to, and perhaps add 1 additional session to devote it to the Lachin Road. And Mr. Oliphant is saying that he does not think it should be referred to as the corridor, but as the road.
So, Mr. Chair, you have Mr. Bergeron who has his hand up, and after Ms. McPherson.
Mr. Bergeron.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Vous me semblez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You seem to know a lot about the amendment suggested by Mr. Oliphant, strangely. Like my colleague, I wasn't sure I fully understood the meaning of this amendment.
Point of order.
Mr. Oliphant.
I take great umbrage with respect to that. I have not discussed this amendment with anyone, including the chair, and an assumption of that implies something somehow nefarious, and I would like that withdrawn, please.
We revert back to Mr. Bergeron.
Alors, Monsieur Oliphant, nous semble...
Mr. Oliphant, you seem to be a little sensitive after the holidays. I did not have any bad intentions, but I will carry on with the point that I wanted to make. The problem with Mr. Oliphant's suggestion is that we are up against an emergency situation. This is a humanitarian situation in the real world that's getting worse and worse as we speak. I don't think that we can wait until the House is sitting again to speak of this topic. 6 members of the committee have shared the fact that we need to quickly look at this problem. And the goal would be to avoid overstepping and taking up time with our regular business. So personally, I do not want to slow down any other business, be it what was already planned on the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan or that on women's reproductive health. And so we would like to meet sooner. Firstly, we would like to do this because the situation is urgent and thus requires us to speak earlier. And secondly, to avoid using up time that could be used on other topics to ensure that we're able to quickly keep working on what was previously planned by the committee. So I thought that my Liberal colleagues would appreciate this suggestion, and so I'm somewhat surprised to hear this reaction this afternoon. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. We will now go to Ms. McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to just take a moment to wish everyone on the committee a Happy New Year. We haven't seen each other in person yet, but Happy New Year to all of you. From my perspective, I'm looking forward to this spring session being much more productive than the Foreign Affairs was prior to that. My thinking with regards to this particular study is it is urgent. It is perhaps an opportunity for this committee to restart. We were not able to complete our work in the previous session because of filibustering, because of disagreements, because of bickering within the committee, and I would like to stop that behavior. I don't think that does any good for this committee. It doesn't do any good considering the amount of work that we need to do as the Foreign Affairs Committee. So I look forward to adding this meeting so that we can discuss this, that we can put this this important issue in front of this committee, that we can get this work done. Perhaps restart this committee to some degree so that we can continue on with the other important pieces that we have not completed, including the report on Pakistan and the report on Ukraine. And frankly, I think we also need to have a working committee because of what is happening in the world right now. We still have a devastating illegal war happening in Ukraine. We still have conflicts happening around the world. And in fact, I am going to read a motion very quickly into the record because I do think we also need to, as a Foreign Affairs Committee, be looking at what is happening in Iran. So I'll read it in. But I will say before I do that I support this work, that I support we move forward as urgently as we can and treat this, I'd hope all committee members will treat this as a bit of a reset for this committee so that we can actually do the job that the Canadians have sent us to Ottawa to do. But I very quickly will read into the record that the committee holds 3 meetings to study the current situation in Iran, including examining the federal government's refusal for listing of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, as a terrorist entity. 2, that the connections between people or assets in Canada and the IRGC. And 3, paths forward to support Iranian human rights activists, artists, journalists, and other political refugees. That the committee invite the Minister of Foreign Affairs to testify, as well as additional witnesses submitted by members of the committee, and that the committee report its findings back to the House, and that pursuant to Standing Order 109, the government table a comprehensive response to the report. I will send this out in both official languages to everyone, but I did want to make sure that it was read into the record. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. I just would like to add, in response to your remarks, that we had also agreed that before the parliamentary calendar does resume, that we would have a subcommittee meeting, and that is precisely because of some of the issues that Ms. McPherson alluded to. Now, I will now go to Dr. Fry.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to support Rob Oliphant's amendment. I think that while this is an urgent issue, what will Canada do? What will our hearings do to do anything other than what France and the United States, who are both members of the Minsk Agreement through OSCE, and they've both actually intervened, and the EU has now moved forward to ensure that some things are going. Azerbaijan and Armenia are really wanting to work with this process right now. And I just don't see that in the next 3 weeks that we are going to suddenly, as Canada, deal with this when the people who have actually authority for dealing with it, which is a Minsk group, notably Europe, notably France and the United States, as well as Russia, who has also met with the two groups. And if you recall, in September, Russia had stepped in and said that it would participate in bringing about some kind of agreement. So I think things are moving forward in the only way that they can. Our committee meeting and discussing this isn't going to suddenly fast forward change. I just think that we can wait, as we had said before, and listen to what the subcommittee says about the about the procedure for where we go next when we start back again. I'm so sorry, excuse me. Sorry about that. That's all I have to say, actually, that I agree with Rob's amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fry. We now go to Ms. Bendayan.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. To respond to what Mr. Bergeron said, personally, I think it's a great suggestion that we meet next week. And I say this because we already have January 31st set aside for a first meeting on the topic, so I don't see there's any problem in adding other meetings next week. But what's for sure is that the issue that we are discussing right now, that being on the Lachine corridor, is very important, and I think that we should be focusing on it as soon as possible.
Mr. Bergeron has his hand up.
Mr. Bergeron, the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't take too long. I'd just like to react to what Madame Fry has said. I'm not naive enough to believe that the work of this committee is going to allow for the quick lifting of the blockade at the Lachin Road. That being said, there is an international concept that is called the responsibility to protect. And it was a Liberal Prime Minister that introduced this. It was Paul Martin. And then this was supported by the entire international community in 2005. I don't think that we have the right to remain inactive under the pretext that simply whatever we do will not change the situation. A declaration that probably would only have a symbolic benefit was already done for Tibet, for example. So yes, it was symbolic, but it was still extremely important. So with the utmost respect, I do think that we need to focus on this issue. And I think that we have the moral obligation to do so because there is a humanitarian crisis that is developing right now. And so we have the ethical obligation to do so. Now, if you don't mind, I will be sharing a discussion that me and Mr. Oliphant had over email. My goal is that members of this committee have the most detailed and updated information on what is happening with the committee. So, from the perspective of members of the committee being well informed, and from the perspective of the responsibility that we hold and the values that we defend, we are required to meet. The goal is not to add meetings simply to slow down the work of the committee. You know that this is not the spirit in which I work. I don't want to slow down the committee. I, in reality, want to begin this session by respecting as much as possible the schedule that we have laid out for ourselves. And so, like Ms. Bendayan said, I think it's important that we meet next week because the situation is so urgent, and also because we have a schedule for business that we need to respect.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. I understand the next person with their hand up is Mr. Jennis.
Thank you, Chair. I just have a brief procedural point and then a substantive point as well. Procedurally, we had a motion on the floor, and then we had Mr. Oliphant make what he termed an amendment, but what sounded more like a suggestion. He didn't say remove this word, move this section. He sort of said, he described what he would like to do. I guess I'm a little bit confused if we're discussing the suggestion of Mr. Oliphant as it relates to the motion of Mr. Bergeron, or if there's a specific amendment on the table. And if there is, I wonder if that specific amendment could be defeated, because if there's a specific amendment on the table, we'll need to vote up or down on that amendment and then the motion. So with respect to the larger issue, and I want to thank Mr. Bergeron for putting this forward. I was pleased to join him and my Conservative colleagues, as well as Ms. McPherson, in signing that letter. I think the horrors of what we're seeing, the significant humanitarian challenges of people in Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh certainly have been moving for me to see and read about. I think we are seeing a blockade that is in clear violation of international law and also undermining efforts to pursue peace and security. And I think we want to hear from both sides in the tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But in particular, I would like to hear the voices of those that are directly affected, those that are in Artsakh, that are experiencing this situation. And I'm glad that Mr. Bergeron included some of those names in his motion. I think one other issue for the committee to think about as we turn our attention to this issue is the issue of Russian influence in the Transcaucasus region. Historically, Russia has had a fair bit of influence there, but the failure of the ostensible peacekeeping force from Russia to do their job, to facilitate the development of peace, is, I think, an important strategic development, and it speaks maybe to the need for greater engagement of other countries that have been historically less engaged in that region, to offer to play a greater role in promoting peace and stability. And it's, of course, part of this larger story of what is happening with Russia and its effort to project influence. So I think, first and foremost for me, it's the humanitarian situation, but I think also there are a variety of different considerations that should really motivate the committee in wanting to look at that. So I want to underline my support for Mr. Bergeron's motion and initiative here, and also maybe, Chair, if you can provide some clarity on the procedural point, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jennis. Before we go to Dr. Fry, I understand that Mr. Oliphant has his hand up as well. Would be grateful, Mr. Oliphant, if you could clarify if that was an amendment or just simply a suggestion.
Probably both. It was not able to be a formal amendment because I didn't have the text of Mr. Bergeron's motion until I have it now. So it's hard to make an amendment on something when you don't have the text in front of you. Right now, the motion that has been presented calls for the committee to undertake to hold a maximum of 3 meetings to study the present situation of the blockade of the Latin corridor. I would amend those words to say that the committee undertake to hold 1 additional meeting to the already agreed to 2 meetings with respect to Nagorno-Karabakh, with the 3rd meeting focusing particularly on the Lachin Road. So, and I will try to do that again, but I'm not writing this down. So it's that the committee undertake to hold an additional meeting in addition to the 2 meetings already agreed to on Nagorno-Karabakh, that we hold an additional meeting. So it's for a total of 3 meetings on the Lachin Road. I'm sorry, the clerk may have to help me with this because what I'm trying to do is to simply say, instead of 3 more meetings, which would make 5 meetings on Nagorno-Karabakh, I think that is too many given Iran, given the other topics that we are constantly talking about this meeting. I think a total of 3 meetings, including 1 dedicated to the Lachin Road, would be appropriate for this study. I'm not getting into the timing of that. I'll leave that to the chair and the subcommittee because that has been raised as well. So the intent of my amendment is to have, instead of 5 meetings on the topic, we would have 3 meetings on the topic, including 1 dedicated to the Lachin Road issue.
Thank you.
1 meeting has already been held, just for information. We've had 1 meeting. We were already scheduled to have 1 meeting when we first came back. This adds a 3rd meeting, which I think is useful and important, but I don't want 5 meetings.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Oliphant. I'm pretty sure that's now an amendment through and through. So, Dr. Fry, we now go to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. I am sure that Mr. Bergeron did not mean to misunderstand what I said. I at no time said that this was unimportant. I have personally met with members of parliament from both sides in Poland about this issue just before. I continue to correspond with these members of parliament on this issue because of the OSCE being very involved in part of the Minsk agreement. So it is something that I am involved with. It's something that I am aware of on an ongoing basis. All I was saying, and I think I was agreeing with Mr. Oliphant, is that we could do it with fewer meetings, and that the chair will obviously decide when we do it. But I thought that we were going to start as the first meeting on January the 31st, and I thought that we would be able to move on to the other meeting that Mr. Oliphant was referring to. I did not in any way suggest that it was not important. I was suggesting that meeting more and meeting before the 31st wasn't going to resolve anything in such a hurry. So I was continuing to say, let the status quo stand, plus 1 new meeting dedicated to Lachin Road.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fry. I don't see any other hands.
Yes.
Mr. Oliphant, is your hand down? Mr. Bergeron?
Merci, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Firstly, I'd like to specify that I never wanted to lead anyone to believe that Ms. Fry was saying that she didn't deem the situation important. I think it's important to specify that. And then the second thing concerning Mr. Oliphant's motion, unfortunately, I will have to vote against this amendment. It's for a very simple reason. That being, there is this conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and this is a current situation that is now a part of the conflict. But I'm asking us to no longer look at this from a political or geopolitical perspective, but more so a humanitarian perspective. I don't think that we can wait until the House is sitting again, because each day that goes by has a humanitarian effect on the situation. And I don't think that we can say that what's happening right now at Lachin Road as something that is the equivalent to the political situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And like I said, on the one hand, it's more political, whereas the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict is more political. This is more humanitarian. But also, because Armenia and Azerbaijan aren't directly involved, this is a protest that is being held by Azerbaijani activists, and they're using this to block the Lachin Road, meaning that people are not able to move through freely, and what this also means is that basic goods are not able to make it where they need to go. I'm not sure if Mr. Oliphant has information that I don't have. If he does, I would like to have access to them. What's important, I think, is that we all be well informed of the situation, because right now we're all going off of information that the media or interest groups want to share, and that's why it's important that we meet. And that's why I want us to meet not when the House sits again, but next week, so that we be able to take a look at this specific situation. Situation that, like I said, involves our humanitarian values. And then later on, we can look at the broader questions, political questions related to Armenia and Azerbaijan. But what matters right now is that there is this so-called group of protesters that have blocked a landlocked territory made up of Armenians, and this has serious humanitarian consequences.
Thank you for that, Mr. Bergeron. I don't see anyone else with their hand up. Am I correct in that assumption? Oh, Dr. Fry.
I hate to belabor this, but I think this assumption that we're all only getting this information from the media is not true. I think I just spoke, and I don't know if my English is as flawed as my French, but what I did say is that I'm in contact regularly with parliamentarians who are in the thick of this at the OSCE. I met with the Armenian delegation and with the Azerbaijan delegation in November. I continue to speak with them on text and email to see how the situation is moving. So I'm not just getting my information from the media. Thank you.
Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you. Yes.
Ms. McPherson has her hand up, please.
Ms. McPherson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one quick thing I wanted to throw into this mix is I do think it is important that we are respectful to our witnesses and ensure that we don't have witnesses from either side testifying at the same time at the same meeting. I think that would be completely inappropriate. Just want to make sure. I'm sure you've already thought of that, Mr. Chair, but I wanted to make sure that was articulated.
Absolutely. I remember this issue being raised in December, so we will ensure that we proceed in a fashion which is such that we will hear from proponents and opponents. Is there anyone else who would like to speak to Mr. Oliphant's amendment? Yes, Ms. Ben-Dayan.
Mr. Chair, perhaps just a question of clarification. Does either Mr. Bergeron's motion or Mr. Oliphant's amendment specify the exact date or timing of these meetings? I don't believe so. And so this issue of when these meetings would be held is not actually before the committee at this time. Is that right?
Yes, I can only presume that Mr. Oliphant did not provide any specifics as to, yes.
I can say I did not, but the motion itself presented by Mr. Bergeron says that this happened by Friday, February the 3rd. So it is in the original motion. I didn't change that. I still think that would be possible to accomplish by February 3rd, meaning we'd have 2 meetings by February 3rd. If the amendment fails, then we'll have to find a way to have, I guess, 4 meetings by February the 3rd.
Thank you for that precise response, Mr. Oliphant. We now go to Mr. Bergeron.
Je veux simplement préciser pour le bénéfice de...
I just want to clarify for Mr. Oliphant that in the motion it also states that the committee undertakes to hold a maximum of 3 meetings to study the present situation of the blockade of the Lachine corridor. If we want to, this would be added to what was already planned, so that would make 4. But there would be only 3 that would be on the blockade of the Lachine corridor. So we're speaking of a maximum of 3. It could be 2.
Would anyone else like to speak to this issue?
Mr. Chong has his hand up, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Mr. Chong, the floor is yours.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So just to clarify, if Monsieur Bergeron's motion passes unamended, we would have 3 meetings by the end of the first week that the House of Commons resumes sitting at the end of this month. So that presumably would mean that we would have 1 meeting next week and then 2 meetings in our regularly scheduled slots during the first week that the House resumes sitting. Is that, Mr. Chair, a safe assumption of how the planning would take place?
As far as I do understand, yes, that is an accurate read of it. However, technically speaking, when the invitation was sent out to the 2 witnesses for the first session we have upon our return, it wasn't specifically on the issue of the Lachin Road. So okay. I query whether that poses any challenges insofar as the members are concerned.
So second question of clarification on this motion in front of us right now. If the motion is adopted, does that subsume, do those 3 meetings subsume the second of the 2 meetings that we had previously agreed to, which is tentatively scheduled for January 31st? So in other words, would we have simply 3 more meetings on Armenia and Azerbaijan in total, point final, or would we have the 3 meetings specified by Monsieur Bergeron's motion by the end of February 3rd, and then we would have another 4th meeting that had been previously scheduled for January 31st? So I'd like a clarification on which of the 2 would be the case if Monsieur Bergeron's motion is adopted by the committee unamended.
As far as I understand, Mr. Chong, I think your read of it is accurate. But just to
I don't have a read on the situation. I'm asking you which of the 2
sure.
it is.
I think they're reconcilable unless Mr. Bergeron or Mr. Oliphant have something different to say.
So in other words, what you're telling us today, right now, is that if
Monsieur Bergeron's motions adopted, unamended, we would have 3 more meetings on Armenia and Azerbaijan, no more than that, and that the tentatively scheduled meeting for January 31st would be part of those 3 meetings, correct?
Yes, subject again to the caveat that when those invitations were sent out to the Armenian ambassador and to the Azerbaijani chargé, that it was generally about Nagorno-Karabakh. It wasn't specifically about the issue of the Lachin Road.
Thank you.
But yes, Mr. Oliphant.
So we have a bit of a procedural problem then, because the committee has passed a motion to do a 2-meeting study on Armenia, and we have done one of the meetings. This motion does not refer to that study whatsoever. This is a completely separate study on the same area. And as Mr. Bergeron has said, his intention is to do something different. The first meeting was geopolitical and diplomatic, and about the conflict which had begun in 2020, and there's been skirmishes, and we know the issue of that. We also have, in that intervening time, détente between Azerbaijan and Armenia, where the Prime Minister of Armenia and the President of Azerbaijan are in discussion with each other. And that had not happened before. So there is a geopolitical reality that this committee should be apprised of, because the conflict that happened in 2020 has significantly changed. We have now an area of Nagorno-Karabakh that was taken by force, reclaimed, as they say in Azerbaijan, an area that was diplomatically settled with agreement by Armenia, and an area which is being controlled by the Russian military for 5 years, until 2025. So we have that area of Nagorno-Karabakh that is a very important discussion to have, because there's a Minsk process, there's the EU process, and there is the Russian forces that are present. Mr. Bergeron's motion does not have anything to do with that. It has to do with a situation that has to do with a mine that is in the Russian-occupied area, and a road that links Nagorno-Karabakh with the main part of Armenia that goes through uncontested area of Azerbaijan. I agree both are important, but I just following up on Mr. Chong, I think he's clarifying it importantly, because they're 2 separate studies. I don't think we can simply say, unless there's a motion from this committee, to not do the study that we agreed to do on geopolitics or put it aside. What we're asked to do is have 3 special meetings on a new study, tangentially related to the other study, but not the same. So that's my dilemma, that we end up with 5 meetings on the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh instead of 2. I'm very agreed to add 1. I would even agree to add 2. I mean, I don't want to be a jerk about this. I just don't think we need 3 meetings on the Lachin Road situation. I can, if someone wanted to entertain and we have a discussion and we reach a consensus to do 4 meetings altogether, 2 on the geopolitical, 2 on the humanitarian issue, I can live with that. I just don't think 5 meetings at this time, when we've got so many other issues in the world going on, that we should take all that time on this issue. So 3 meetings is my preference. If there's a consensus for 4 meetings, 2 and 1 more on the geopolitical situation, I'm okay. Recognizing that we'll have an overlap of the witnesses, because we want to hear from the 2 diplomats, one from Azerbaijan, the chargé, and the ambassador, who would be coming probably about both issues. But I think for our good learning, we probably want to keep some separation of the 2, even though they are intimately related to each other. I don't know, Michael, whether that helps you or hurts you in trying to understand where we're at. But I think we'd have to rescind the other study or delay it.
Yes, if we could go to the clerk. She has her hand up.
Yes, so Mr. Bergeron has his hand up, and then Ms. McPherson, please.
Mr. Bergeron.
Monsieur le Président, je constate.
Mr. Chair, what I can see here is that we're almost on the same page here. Mr. Oliphant, in terms of the wording, like I said, it states the committee undertakes to hold a maximum of 3 meetings. So for us and for the Conservatives, the ideal would be 3, but for the Liberals, maybe it would be 2. For Ms. McPherson, 2 is acceptable. So I think we should look for a compromise. The motion, as it's read right now, without Mr. Oliphant's amendment, actually already allows for this. The one thing that concerns me, once again, is to make sure that we're not taking time away from that business which has already been planned. And so, if possible, I would like us to hold 2 meetings next week, that we hold the meeting that was already on our schedule. And if we can come to an agreement with this suggestion, then I think everyone would be happy, unless I have misunderstood something.
We now go to Ms. McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we're also very close and should be able to come up with a compromise here. So would it not make sense to I mean, Mr. Bergeron's suggestion seems reasonable. If we could have the 2 meetings for his study next week and then complete our study the following week, we could meet everybody's needs, and it would be a productive use of time. Would that work for everyone if we did that?
Donc, on en comprend que M. Oliphant retire son amendement.
So Mr. Oliphant is taking away his amendment?
If I had unanimous consent, I can withdraw the amendment with unanimous consent. But I think we need an understanding about the way we are going to do this, because I know that when the clerk starts to schedule witnesses, it's not our life. Could be we do 2 meetings here and then 1 the next week, and we have it all perfectly planned in our head. But when she actually talks to the witnesses, it's sometimes just not the reality that they're available when we want them, or there's overlap, or we're trying to make sure that we don't have conflicting diaspora groups in the room at the same time, all those kinds of things. I understand that. So I just want to get it nailed down to exactly what we're asking the chair to schedule for meetings.
Yes, we next go to, would the clerk like to speak to that?
Yes, please. We had Mr. Bergeron and up first, and then Mr. Janice.
Okay, but with respect to the issue raised by Mr. Oliphant, but we will go to Mr. Bergeron first.
Je crois qu'une des préoccupations, Monsieur le Président, de nos...
I think one of the concerns of our Conservative colleagues, and Mr. Genius, I think, can share his own opinion on the question in a minute. But I think for our Conservative colleagues, the concern is that within the time available in 2 meetings, and considering the fact that we don't want to bring people from different sides of the issue at the same time, the fear is that we won't be able to hear from all the witnesses that we would like to hear from, and those who are included, of course, in the motion. But the question, and I think it's easy to answer, will we be able to hear from the ambassador of Armenia and the chargé d'affaires of Azerbaijan? They will want to speak of the political tension, but also the situation at Lachin Road. So I wonder if we could exclude the ambassador of Armenia and the chargé d'affaires in this motion, seeing as they will have already have been here speaking of the other issue. So they'll be speaking of the Lachine Road. And then later on, we will hear from those who I mentioned otherwise in this motion. Would this be a good compromise? That could potentially be a solution. But Mr. Genius can share his opinion in a moment. And then I think we'll have a more detailed idea of if this would work.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. We now go to Mr. Janis.
Thank you, Chair. I would just underline briefly that I think the flexibility members are looking for in terms of whether it's 2 or 3 meetings, exactly when those meetings happen and how the clerk will schedule them. I mean, I think all of that is well captured in the original motion that Mr. Bergeron put forward, which entails a maximum of 3 meetings, not necessarily 3 meetings, that entails the flexibility already. So I would suggest that the committee simply pass the motion and let the clerk do her work from there. But given that the committee is planning on hearing from the diplomatic representatives of Armenia and Azerbaijan under the rubric of the pre-existing study, I think the compromise Mr. Bergeron has proposed is reasonable as well. In any event, what the motion says is we're going to do this quickly, and we're going to get the hearings done before the end of the first sitting week. However many, within that framework it makes sense to have, but I think the motion does establish that flexibility, and so I'm just in support of what Mr. Bergeron said, and I think we're probably ready.
Thank you, Mr. Janis. We now go to Ms. Bendayan.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy that we already almost have a solution, rather. Just to speak to Mr. Bergeron's motion. Earlier, Mr. Bergeron mentioned that he didn't want to hold up our schedule. So before we move on to a vote, I would like to clarify and ensure that we'll be carrying on as planned, because we were in the middle of looking at women's reproductive rights. And it was then that we received Mr. Bergeron's motion. So I would just like to make sure that after this study, we will continue to look at the topic that we were previously in the middle of.
Monsieur le Président, la seule chose que je puisse dire...
Mr. Chair, what I'd like to say is that Ms. Bendayan can completely count on me to ensure that we will continue working on business as was planned. I can't speak for anyone else, though. Now, what I've understood is that there may be things that should be shared in camera, and maybe the subcommittee on procedure would be able to ensure that we're able to get back to the schedule that was planned, and that we be able to work quickly enough to respond to the needs of Canadians and Quebecers. I hope that the work of this committee be able to continue, that the committee no longer be paralyzed, and so I hope that we will be able to continue the schedule as was planned.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. It does appear that we have the possibility of a compromise here. I understand that Mr. Oliphant had a question for the clerk as to what some of the practical considerations would be insofar as inviting additional witnesses. So there were several witnesses named in the motion itself, but we would require to hear from more people. And also, if the clerk could say, in terms of practical experience, when we could possibly have the 2 sessions next week.
Mr. Chair, my hand was back up to just propose a
Sorry.
A sub amendment to Mr. Oliphant's.
My apologies. Okay.
Amendment just on the scheduling of witnesses, but I'm happy to hand over the floor to Mr. Oliphant if he would like to do that directly. But I think it would be important to make sure that we do schedule the witness deadline so that all members can submit their suggested witnesses. If there are any additional witnesses to be suggested to those already outlined by Mr. Bergeron for this particular motion, and also a deadline for the women's reproductive study so that witnesses can be submitted as well by all parties for that study. And given Mr. Bergeron's comment in indicating that we would resume, in his view, at least from what I understand, the committee schedule immediately thereafter, I wonder, Mr. Chair, if you would like to comment on that.
If you would like me to comment on it, or whether Mr.
No, you, Mr. Chair, in terms of today, as you indicated at the beginning of the meeting, we are continuing the meeting that was held in December on women's reproductive rights, and that we would that therefore have to pick that back up after this study. Is that your understanding, Mr. Chair?
That is my understanding, but as you will recall, it was agreed previously, and I did repeat it today, that we do have to have a subcommittee meeting next week as well.
Mr. Chair, on that point, you've mentioned the subcommittee twice now, but seeing as how, and I do not sit on the subcommittee, so perhaps that is why I seek clarification. We do not need the subcommittee to reconfirm that we are going back to a study that we are already engaged in. And so I am asking in this meeting publicly for you to confirm that we will go back to the study that we have not finished and indeed not started in any substantive way.
I certainly understand your concern, but allow me, for the purposes of your question, to go to the clerk so she can tell us where things stand insofar as the rules and the procedures are concerned. Madam Clerk, could you answer that question as to what becomes of that issue?
In order to resume witnesses that were appearing during the meeting 43, which we are resuming right now, the decision was made at the beginning of this meeting, so the resumption, to go to the 106.4. So this was the decision. So as of resuming witnesses, no decision has been made to resume questioning of witnesses.
Okay. Did that answer your question, Ms. Bendayan?
No.
I'm a bit lost as well.
Madame Benayan, donc, si je peux me permettre.
Ms. Bendayan, at the beginning of this meeting, there was a dilatory motion that was adopted to move on to the following item. So for 664, so we need the committee to agree upon when we would go back to witnesses.
Mr. Chair, you've heard my view as well as the view of Mr. Bergeron, and so I understand that it is your prerogative to make that decision, and so I'm asking you to confirm to the committee what your decision is.
Well, I don't have a decision. I just want to ensure that I'm going about this properly. But yes, if barring anything that prevents us from doing so, yes, the first meeting after this this issue of Armenia and Azerbaijan, or the Rachin Road, would, it appears to me, go back to reproductive health so we can resume that study, which a majority of the members had already indicated is considerably past due.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Oliphant, did you, because Ms. Ben-Nayan said that maybe you will make some changes just to ensure that there is a compromise with the Latchin Road study? Am I correct in that assumption?
It was the witness submission deadline.
So do you wish to do so?
Sure. I think that, effectively my amendment is withdrawn if we had unanimous consent. So I think we're back to the main motion. I think Ms. Ben-Nayan's comments relate to other issues. I'm not sure we could amend that motion, but I think we have to entertain a motion after this motion about witness deadlines, both for this study and then for women's reproductive health would probably be the easiest way to do that. So we decide what we're going to do. And then we ask for witness deadlines for both this study and then the next study, and get that done. The problem is today is a Wednesday, and next week has only 5 days in it. And that's the way weeks work. And if we're trying to get this, 2 meetings in next week plus a subcommittee, that means you have to schedule 3 meetings for next week. So I'm not going to get into that. But I guess I should confirm that my amendment, I have unanimous consent to withdraw it, and that we are now working on the intent of the committee is not to have 3 meetings on this one, but to do 2 meetings, whatever. We're going to do 2 meetings next week and 1 or 2 the following week, depending on how you're going to get the scheduling done. I think that's what we've sort of agreed to.
Absolutely. So we revert back to Mr. Bergeron's motion. Would there be unanimous consent by the members that we do actually submit witnesses for next week's hearings by end of business day on Friday? Is there unanimous consent? Yes. Yes, Mr. Bergeron.
Monsieur le Président, corrigez-moi si...
Mr. Chair, correct me if I'm wrong, but as Mr. Oliphant said, I think we'll need to write up a list of witnesses for the study on women's reproductive health relatively quickly. But in terms of the Latchin corridor or Latchin Road, since we will only have 2 meetings, it seems, and since we were already concerned about being able to listen or hear all these witnesses within those 2 meetings, could we agree to stick to the list of witnesses that are in the motion that we are discussing right now?
And sorry, just for clarification, how many witnesses were in your motion, Mr. Bergeron?
Bien sûr. Monsieur le Président, il y avait bien sûr...
Mr. Chair, of course, there was the ambassador of Armenia and the chargé d'affaires of Azerbaijan. And we will be hearing from them outside of these 2 meetings. There's representatives of the 2 communities in Canada, the permanent representative of Nagorno-Karabakh, and Gengem Stepanyan. So that's 5. So if we write up a list of witnesses, I think we'll just be multiplying the number of witnesses that we won't have the time to hear. So if we have unanimous consent, I'd suggest that we stick to the witnesses that we have here in the motion, but that we establish a deadline to submit the list of witnesses for women's reproductive health.
Fair enough. Insofar as the witnesses identified in Mr. Bergeron's motion are concerned, do we have unanimous consent that those would be the only witnesses for the purposes of the Latchin Road study?
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais juste demander...
Mr. Chair, I'd just like to ask Mr. Bergeron to clarify the representatives of the two communities in Canada. Shouldn't we submit names for who that will be?
La communauté arménienne.
Well, for the case of the Armenian community, I think this will be the Armenian Community Congress in Canada. For the other witness, I'm pretty sure there is an organization in one of our colleagues' ridings. He may be able to specify this, but I think maybe we could come to an agreement for those two witnesses for members of the two communities, unless there is another potential organization, but I can't think of one right now to represent communities in Canada.
But that's just, sorry. And additionally, there was also the representative from Nagorno-Karabakh that you referenced, Mr. Bergeron. Am I correct, or did I
Oui,
misunderstand?
tout à fait, Monsieur.
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Chair. I was just responding to Ms. Bendayan's question pertaining to who would be the representatives for the two communities in Canada. So, of course, we have Minister of Foreign Affairs and then representatives for the two communities in Canada that I just discussed. And then we have the representative for Nagorno-Karabakh to the United States and Canada, and a human rights defender for Nagorno-Karabakh, who is Mr. Stepanyan.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Yes, Dr. Fry.
I just wanted to say that there are a couple of other organizations that I could forward. So we don't have to discuss them here. We can just forward them to you and the clerk if we have another list of witnesses, because I do have some other people that would be worthwhile listening to.
Mr. Hoback.
Yeah, Chair, just a question for Mr. Bergeron. He's wanting 3 meetings, but he's only given us this limited number of witnesses. How is he seeing the meetings functioning with this small number of witnesses?
Mr. Bergeron has his hand up.
Yes, Mr. Bergeron.
Je ne sais pas comment répondre précisément.
I'm not sure I know how to give a specific answer to this question, since I don't usually organize committee meetings, but I'm trying to desperately find means of agreement between us. So we only want to have 2 meetings, so we don't want to have too long of a list of witnesses. And so what I'm saying is that if we submit a long list of witnesses, I don't think we'll have the time to hear from them within 2 meetings. Or we could have, what I'm saying is that we stick to these within 2 meetings, or we get a long list that we can't really hear from within the time frame of 2 meetings.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. So going forward, yes, Mr. Abultaif.
Thank you, Chair. I just a technical question. Do we have all translation services available for these meetings if they're to take place next week, and in specific the one next week? So I like that to be confirmed, whether by the clerk or someone else, or by yourself, maybe. Thank you.
Yes, the clerk can respond to that.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So would need the process to find out about services is that I would need the time that you would like to meet. So the actual 3 meetings, the time, the day, and I would ask the services if they can have the capacity, and I would know within maximum 24 hours.
One more time.
Yes, Mr.
Thank you. Thanks again. Thanks for the clarification. I guess now how we gonna move forward here, Mr. Chair? We do have some submissions or some amendments to a motion that were withdrawn. Then there was some other topics. I mean, I don't think I sit clear on where we are right now based on from the beginning when Mr. Bergeron suggested it or submitted his motion to where we are now with all the different discussions and topics. I think I'll be honest with you, I'm just lost here in where we're going and where we stand. So thanks.
Absolutely, I have to concede that I'm somewhat lost as well, because when I hear about the number of witnesses, I don't think that's a sufficient number of witnesses for the two sessions, which would occur next week should this motion be adopted. Am I correct in that, Madam Clerk?
One thing I can say is that the minister is one of the witnesses and she appears alone usually, so it would be 1 hour out of the 4 hours for the two meetings. And then it would all depend on how you want to divide your panel in light of the comment that was made earlier to make sure that the two countries are appearing at different times. So you can have one witness per panel, so the amount is up to you.
Sure. It does seem that for 4 hours, it would be a bit of a stretch to have the witnesses that are named. So would there be unanimous consent for every
Chair, can
party?
I speak to the floor? Can you please
Sure.
recognize...
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize you had your hand up previously. I thought that you had forgotten to take down your hand. I apologize, Mr. Hoback. Please.
No, I just was getting back to Mr. Bergeron on the witness list. I agree with his witness list, and I agree with his thought process that we don't want to water it down. We end up only getting 10 or 15 minutes, not enough time to effectively question the witnesses. So I don't necessarily mind what he's proposing in this situation, because of it gives us more time to get complete rounds in and ask questions of the minister. For example, for an hour, get a complete round in with all the members for questions and answers with the minister. And then with the other witnesses, it gives us a chance to have a complete set of rounds for all of us to get a chance to question and ask questions and that. So I can see where he's coming from, and I agree with him on that. It's up to you to figure out how to make it function. And I guess if a meeting ends early, it ends early. That's just the way it is. The only other thing I wanted to mention, Chair, next Thursday and Friday, Conservative members won't be available. So when you start looking at logistics for when you're going to hold this, it's going to have to be Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, because we have our own caucus meetings Thursday and Friday next week.
Thank you for bringing that to our attention. We certainly wouldn't have known about that. Madam Clerk, first of all, Dr. Fry, is your hand still up, or? Yes,
my hand is up. I wanted to suggest that traditionally, I'm not trying to be to insult Mr. Bergeron, but I think some of us have a list of other people that would be delighted to come, who actually may be on the ground and on the spot that could present to us. So all I'm suggesting is, why don't we do what is traditional, which is everyone sends in a list of witnesses, and people decide on who those witnesses are. The clerk tries to get who the clerk can to fill the spots. And I don't believe that we need to say that we're not going to be given due. Listen, what we need to get is a diversity of voices, not just the voices that we currently have on the table right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fry. We next go to Mr. Oliphant.
I'm just supporting Dr. Fry. I think that the committee puts itself in a very risky situation if our dominant witnesses are people who live in Canada and are not actually firsthand aware of what the situation is. I also think we put ourselves in a difficult position if we have two sets of opinions as opposed to an expert who's neutral. I think we need a number of witnesses who present a neutral position that is not shaded by the other topic, which is geopolitical. And so I think, we can get opinions, but if we only hear opinions, then we're left in the situation of a he said, she said, which I don't think the committee should be doing. I think we need some real witnesses. I can't speak. I haven't had a chance. I agree. Just noting that our Liberal caucus is actually, I think, on Friday of next week. So we would not be able to do Thursday or Friday. Thursday, I think we're available, but if you're not, we're not. So we're down to Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And today's Wednesday. I do not know the minister's schedule. I'm never privy to that, but it is a break week from Parliament, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs is often traveling. That's her job. So I have no idea whether she would be available on those 3 limited days. So if we don't have a little bit of a more robust list, I think we could end up wasting our time. So I really do believe we need to follow our standard procedures, as Dr. Fry said, where we don't just take witnesses coming from one source. We have a number of witnesses, and we make sure we have some expert, neutral, independent witnesses who can actually tell us what's happening on the ground, not because they read about it on the internet.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. We now go to the clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you have Ms. McPherson on the list, then Mr. Abou-Taïf, Mr. Bergeron, and then Dr. Fry.
Ms. McPherson.
Just very quickly and briefly, I'd like to point out that the NDP retreat is today, and nobody considered that while they were scheduling the meetings. Thank you.
It's a good point.
Good point, Ms. McPherson. But as you know, as I indicated, I was not aware of it. And I don't believe anyone was aware of it. So our apologies and our thanks also that you have taken time out of that. Now we go
point
to
of order. Point of order. Just in defense of the chair on that, it's an SO 106-4, and there were 5 days. There were 6 members, including Ms. McPherson, who signed the 106-4. You only had 5 days. You had to give 48 hours notice. I don't think you had the choice with respect to a caucus meeting that was happening that you didn't know about. So I just think we need to defend the chair a little bit on that it's not, it's under the standing orders. We have a 5-day limit, and he had to do it, and he had to give 48 hours notice. Kind of difficult. And the clerk had to get the right information because we had a suspended meeting, which has never happened in living memory. So just to give a little bit of credit to our chair. Not that he needs someone helping him.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. We now go to Mr. Abou-Taïf.
Thanks again, Chair. I just also still not clear on witnesses. If the clerk can assist us, or at least assist me in understanding what is the timelines to call for the witnesses. How can we wrap up this quickly in a way that, I mean, we're looking at sort of an urgent meeting next week on irregular schedule. And we're struggling to find a ground here where we're moving on this. In addition, of course, now we see that Mr. Oliphant still complaining about or supporting at least Dr. Fry on the witnesses and the call for more witnesses to make sure that the study is well worth the time and the urgency. So again, from the clerk and from your chair, if you can explain to me this part, I think will be very important. Thank you.
Mr. Abou-Taïf, thank you very much for your question and your concern. But I have to say, it is up to the members. It's not up to the clerk to determine how it's going to work with witnesses. That is a decision that all of the members present today have to make, but there has been some toing and froing. Mr. Bergeron has indicated that he would only like us to go with the witnesses that were identified in the motion that was submitted. Whereas others are saying, well, we don't feel comfortable with that because there might be a paucity, especially given the fact that one of those witnesses was our Minister of Foreign Affairs. So it really is up to the members to make that determination, and I have every confidence that we can get there.
So, if I may, what is the roadmap in this specific case now? Again, we're still in a muddy situation here. We
Sure.
really don't. What's the roadmap?
Well, we're in a muddy situation because there is a disagreement between the members. But ultimately, we should listen to both sides, and all of us can decide as to which one of those considerations are more valid, as to whether we should only go with the witnesses that were identified in the motion, or alternatively set a date to submit more witnesses. That's the decision before
One
us.
more clarification. If the original motion by Mr. Bergeron yet to be was voted on and already passed, that means we basically agreed to his witness list, and there's no room for other parties or sides to be doing so. I know Mr. Oliphant is shaking his head on this, but I just want that clarification to take place, please. Thank you.
Absolutely. Mr. Hoback, is your hand up?
Yes, it is.
Apologies. Yes.
What Ziad is saying is actually very true. Like, if we've already passed the motion, then why are we having this debate? If it's something amendment that they want to make to the motion, then that's what they have to go through. Is they have to propose an amendment to go from the witnesses suggested to something other than that. Now, I would ask Mr. Bergeron's guidance, though, in regards to the witnesses that he has picked out there. What does he think is the appropriate amount of time he should have them in front of the committee so that they don't get shortchanged if he ended up adding more witnesses to the list?
Monsieur le Président?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I think I'm the next on the list of speakers. I'm just going to jump in to state that I am after Mr. Abdeltaïf in terms of the list of speakers. And I would like to speak to the point of order. That wasn't really a point of order. I don't think that Mr. Oliphant really needed to save the chair. I don't think Ms. McPherson was trying to blame anyone. She was just trying to state an objective fact, saying that the NDP caucus was held today. And so if it was possible to have this meeting today during the NDP caucus, then it should be possible to do the same thing during another party's caucus. She was not blaming the chair, and so I don't think Mr. Oliphant had reason to defend the speaker, rather the chair, seeing as he was not being attacked. That being said, I am okay if my list of witnesses is not the one that is retained, but I would like to say to my colleagues that in the time frame of 2 witnesses, it's difficult to do more than what we see here in the motion. I'd like to remind you that we are sticking to 2 meetings. So we seem to want to aim to reach 2 goals that don't work together. We want to stick to 2 meetings, and we want to have a longer list of witnesses. I don't think this is possible, unfortunately. So I think there's 2 solutions. Either we stick to this list of witnesses and we stick to 2 meetings, or we add more witnesses. But then we would need to have 3 meetings and not 2.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Let me also clarify for all the members that Mr. Bergeron's motion has yet to pass. And I only say this just to correct what Mr. Hoback said, but we now go to Mr. Oliphant.
Speaking on the motion, and first of all, I don't see the list of suggested witnesses in the motion as exhaustive. I think that they're inclusive but not exhaustive, so that there can be other witnesses added. Mr. Bergeron has said that this is meant to be a study on the humanitarian, a reported humanitarian crisis. I only saw this motion when others did today. I didn't see it before this meeting. it would seem to me I'd like to talk to the International Committee of the Red Cross or the Red Crescent. I'd like to talk to the UN. I would like to talk to authorities who have an understanding of what the humanitarian situation is, what the blockade is about, what the effects of it are. Is it a political issue that we are hearing about from people outside of Nagorno-Karabakh? Is it a humanitarian crisis? I think there needs to be at least one witness who is from a humanitarian agency, someone who actually knows the humanitarian situation in the area, as opposed to giving us a political understanding of what's going on. If we're really going to do this as separate from the geopolitical, we should do it from a humanitarian crisis aid perspective, which means getting the usual group of of witnesses, the usual suspects, the usual witnesses who tell us what is going on. And that could be the World Food Program. That could be, I don't have an answer on who they should be at this very second, because that's what we do. We do some research on this to find out who would be the best witnesses to help the committee understand the crisis that Mr. Bergeron has, importantly brought to us. You bring the crisis to us, but now I think it's also respectful to make sure that everyone on the committee does our work, where we can look at what witnesses should go. So with that being made, and I think Mr. Hoback was correct, there's not an amendment on the floor. I think mine was withdrawn. So I would simply add to this amendment, and that there be a deadline of this Friday, whatever the date is, the 20th, at noon for additional witnesses from all members of the committee.
Just a point of order, Mr. Oliphant said add to this amendment. This isn't a sub amendment. This is a new amendment.
Add to the motion.
Okay.
No,
sorry,
I think we had agreement that my amendment was withdrawn. We've got a consensus, not really voted on, that we're moving towards 2 meetings on this particular issue. We're going to try to get them down Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of next week. So the amendment is simply that additional witnesses be submitted to the clerk by Friday at noon, I'm going to say. That gives us tomorrow to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. Is there agreement with what has been proposed?
My hand has been up, Chair, for quite a while.
Yep, absolutely.
Maybe you can't see it very well, but it has been up for quite a while.
Dr. Fry.
Thank you. I'm not going to repeat what Rob said, because that was what I was going to say. But I do want to point out, just generically, that when we consider being in one place at a time to attend a meeting, those of us, i.e. Randeep Sarai and I, who come from British Columbia, need to travel the day before we come to Ottawa. And so for almost a whole day, when you add the 3-hour time difference and the 5-hour plane ride, we're not available. So you're automatically shutting us out of a meeting, even if we wish to come, because we can't even do it virtually on the plane. Just wanted to point that out, to remember that there is a part of the country that is west of the Ontario border. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fry. We now go to Mr. Hoback.
Here, Dr. Fry. I have the same issue that she has, and add 3 hours of driving on top of it. So it can be a challenge, but we'll do what we can to be there for sure. No, I just want to hear the clerk read out what the motion would read with the amendment that's being proposed.
Thank you. Good call, Mr. Hoback. Yes, can the clerk please read out the motion that's been amended?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the motion with the amendment would read as follows: that pursuant to Standing Order 108-2, the committee undertakes to hold a maximum of 3 meetings to study the present situation of the blockage of the Lachin Road or corridor, de facto isolating the Nagorno-Karabakh region, that the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada, the Ambassador of Armenia, the Chargé d'Affaires AI of Azerbaijan, representatives of the 2 communities in Canada, the permanent representative of the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic to the United States and Canada, and Gegam Stepanyan, the Nagorno-Karabakh human rights defender, be invited to testify by Friday, February 3, 2023, that the testimony and materials gathered by the committee at these meetings be taken into consideration in the study of the security of the Azerbaijan-Armenia borders, and that the deadline to submit additional witnesses to the clerk be at noon this Friday, February 20.
Okay. Is there any chance? Is it the will of the members unanimously to accept that? Yes, Mr. Oliphant. Mr. Oliphant?
No, I was just saying yes. I'm happy with this. But
is everyone okay? It seems like everyone is okay with that. Okay, excellent. I should say that we look forward to, yes, Mr. Janice.
Sorry, and I didn't mean to interrupt your flow. Just to come afterwards. My understanding is now that we've adopted the motion, the amendment and the main motion. I did just want to, if there's agreement of the committee, suggest that we invite our analysts to prepare revisions to the draft report on Ukraine that respond to emergent events in the intervening time, and that be distributed so that the committee can proceed on that forthwith at the appropriate time. We can discuss the order at another time, but I think it'll take the analysts maybe some time to look at that. So if there's agreement, maybe we want to give the analysts the mandate from the committee to prepare and distribute that revised version.
Sounds like a very good idea. Is there any disagreement there?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Bergeron has his hand up.
Oh, okay, Mr. Bergeron.
Aucun désaccord avec ce que...
I agree with what Mr. Janice just said. I wanted to talk about the motion that was just adopted. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Chair. But I think at the same time we adopted the amendment and the motion. Is that the case? Okay, what I also understand is that the goal is that we only have 2 meetings. But I also understand that given the list of witnesses that you will establish, this would allow us to hold a 3rd meeting.
Well, it would be 2 meetings next week and then the additional one the Tuesday following.
En fait, je précise, Monsieur le Président, que la...
Just to clarify, Mr. Chair, the meeting the following Tuesday would have nothing to do with this motion. That was already planned by the committee to discuss the global geopolitical situation. So the following is my question. The consensus that the committee came to is that we are going to try to hold 2 meetings on the situation at Lachine Road. But there are members, and this is what we adopted, that would like to add witnesses. But we also have a limited time, and so we may have to increase the number of meetings to 3 in order to make sure that we are able to hear from all the witnesses that are submitted. So the motion would allow us to add a 3rd meeting. If need be, maybe we wouldn't need to do so, but we don't know yet how many witnesses will be suggested by the parties. And so in consequence, we need to have this buffer of 1 meeting that can be added in order to make sure that we are able to do a full study on Lachine Road. And the witnesses need to be submitted by Friday, February 20th. Have I understood?
You're correct, Mr. Bergeron, in terms of the witnesses being submitted by Friday by noon. But I would ask that you just leave it with the clerk and I. We will endeavor to make sure that we manage to do this in 2 days, in 2 sessions.
C'est bien ce que je dis, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, that's what I do want to say. That would be you and the clerk, as well as the analyst's responsibility to organize the 2 meetings. Because the consent...
Est-ce que je pourrais continuer, s'il vous plaît?
Can I please continue? The consensus is that we are sticking to 2 meetings. But the text of the motion, if the list of witnesses is too long, the motion allows you to hold a 3rd meeting.
No, that's not my read of it. The extent to which...
Vous lisez, Monsieur le Président. Je regrette. Comment vous lisez?
Mr. Chair, unfortunately, I don't see how you could read that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertakes to hold a maximum of 3 meetings. That's 3 meetings. So the informal consensus that we came to is that we need to stick to 2. But 2 meetings with the list of witnesses that we have here on the motion, but people want to add witnesses. And so I don't know how many witnesses we will have on the list Friday at 12 p.m. Maybe we'll have 15 witnesses. Are we going to be able to stick to 2 meetings with 15 witnesses? I don't think so. So, Mr. Chair, what I'm trying to say is that the motion, as it's been adopted, gives you, the analyst, and the clerk the leeway to add a 3rd meeting if need be. Have I understood correctly?
Even that being said, even if it does provide that leeway, I am just asking that you leave it with us. We will endeavor to do it in a fashion that meets with the approval of all the members. As you recall, one of the comments we did hear was the need, for example, to hear from organizations that are following the humanitarian situation on the ground. However, I can assure you we will not take license to invite every single witness that is submitted. So we will try our utmost to actually keep it restricted to 2 sessions,
Sure.
if that's okay with everyone. Yes.
Mr. Hoback here. I kind of interpret it similar to Mr. Bergeron. Like, you've got your priority witnesses aren't actually named in the motion. So I think they definitely need to be invited in the 2 meetings. What I'm very concerned about is we stack the meetings with so many witnesses, we don't give them quality time, nor do we get quality time to ask questions. So that's my concern. I think that's Mr. Bergeron's concern too. I don't want to speak on his behalf, but I assume that's where he's going. So that's where I think the 3rd meeting might be needed. If we see all of a sudden another 6 or 8 witnesses presented, there's no way you can jam them into the 2 meetings. And if you did that, then I'd be very disappointed, because now you've lost the spirit of what the original motion was, and that was to hear on the people that were invited in the motion, and then still allow the committee members, if they had 1 or 2 more witnesses, to be added. Now, if the committee members still think they're vital to the study, then they should be given another meeting to have their members or their witnesses heard from. And if we need to find another time in the day to do that, we don't have to meet. We can meet 3 meetings in a day during a break week. So if you want to stack your meetings on a Tuesday, starting at 11 o'clock to 1, 2 to 3, 3 to 5, you've got that prerogative if the clerk and the administration can do that. So you've got some flexibility if you decide to go down that path. But I do not want to see a whole pile of witnesses in front of a committee where we can't properly ask the questions and get proper rounds of questions. And the priority should be what was mentioned in the motion itself on those witnesses, making sure that they come to the committee first before you consider anybody else.
Yes, I can assure you, Mr. Hoback, that all those witnesses that were identified in the actual motion will be invited. However, it could very well be, as was pointed out by the other members, that, for example, the minister is not available. I think I speak on behalf of all the members also when I say we certainly appreciate the concern that you have identified. None of us like to do that to witnesses, to stack it, so none of us have the opportunity to really, put them in a difficult position and having too many people. So we will endeavor to balance all of those considerations. And in that vein, I would ask that everyone who is actually the parties as they're submitting their witnesses, they don't come up with a lengthy list. I think each party, if you just provided one or two witnesses, that would allow us to make sure that we hear from different perspectives and that to Mr. Hoback's point, there aren't way too many witnesses who we will not have an opportunity to properly question. Is that okay?
Of course, Chair, if you have 8 more witnesses, you can see the problem, can't you? Because you say even if you limit
Mr.
parties to
Hoback,
2
this happens all the time. There are numerous occasions where a wide variety of witnesses are submitted to committees. That doesn't mean that every single one of those witnesses are invited. It happens all the time. So we will endeavor to present, witnesses who are from different perspectives, look at it from a humanitarian perspective. We will endeavor to do that, but I would be grateful if you could just leave that with us, and we will try to do the best we possibly can. But again, if I can emphasize, if each of the parties just sent in a couple of witnesses, that would allow us to ensure that we proceed in the fashion that that you have identified, Mr. Hoback. Is that okay? Okay. So just to remind everyone, please to send
Mr.
in
Chair,
witnesses. Yes.
I have my
I
hand
did
up.
not see that. My apologies. Yes.
Okay, thank you. It's been almost 2 hours, and it's marathonic 2 hours with a lot of uncertainty. I call it a very muddy water we're dealing with here, as far as our muddy situation. And since I'm not sure if you can clarify again to me whether, first of all, the motion of Mr. Bergeron have passed or not, that to be considered the case. So if that is the case, and this is the beginning of a roadmap that we're going to move forward with all the caucus meetings next week and so forth. In lieu of all that, I would like to call for adjournment of this meeting, if I can.
For sure, but let me just assure you that Mr. Bergeron's motion was adopted, Mr. Appeltaif.
So in that case, I move for the meeting to be adjourned, please. Thanks.
Okay, the meeting stands adjourned.
No, it would need to be voted on, sir.
Yes.
It's
sorry. We will proceed to a vote, Madam Clerk, if possible.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chair. So the vote is on to adjourn the meeting. Madame Bendayan.
Je vote non.
Dr. Fry.
Yes.
Mr. Oliphant.
wow. I don't know. Yeah, I'm going to vote yes. Yes, we're going to adjourn the meeting.
Mr. Sorbara.
No.
Mr. Zuberi.
Yes.
Mr. Chong.
Yes.
Mr. Appeltaif.
Indeed, yes.
Mr. Jenius.
Yes.
Mr. Hoback.
Sorry, Ms. Bendayan, but I vote yes.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Comme Mme Bendayan n'a pas eu l'occasion de s'exprimer, je vote non.
Ms. McPherson.
Yes.
Yeas 8, nays 3.
The meeting stands adjourned. Thank you, everyone.